All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's American Ambulance Association webinar. Today's webinar will be a COVID-19 financial relief update, and it'll cover guidance for the second stage of the pandemic. Today's presenters are Brian Werfel, Scott Moore, and Asbel Montes. Before I go ahead and turn it over to Scott to get us started, I just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to ask a question throughout the webinar or at the Q&A time at the end of the webinar, you can do so by just using that Q&A feature on your menu. The chat box is disabled, so please make sure to use that Q&A button. We'll also be sending out a recording of today's presentation and the PowerPoint slides to everyone that's registered. So just be on the lookout for that this afternoon. And now I will hand it over to Scott to get us started.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you all of you for joining us. I appreciate, I know there's a lot that competes for your time, and I appreciate you joining us. I know that there are a ton of COVID-related and other related webinar-based education that's out there, and what we're really trying to do is make sure that we synthesize as much of the information that's fast and furious coming down the pipe and get it to you so that you can continue to do what you do every day. Want to thank you guys for continuing to operate the front line really of healthcare in this country. So I want to thank Mr. Asbel Montes, the Senior VP of Strategic Initiatives and Innovation at Acadian, for joining me, as well as AAA Medicare consultant, attorney Brian Werfel with Werfel and Werfel. So thank you both for joining. So as we get moving, just usually we start most presentations, and this is sort of a typical lawyer thing, right? To say whatever I'm about to say, you shouldn't count on for advice. The American Ambulance Association, its consultant speakers do not provide legal, financial, or accounting advice. Materials intended for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for legal, financial, or accounting advice. You can consult an attorney or an accounting professional in your area. So today, what are we going to cover? So we wanted to, there's been a ton out there about the different financial relief provisions and, available to not only business owners, but also to individuals as in sort of the wake of the pandemic. But what we wanted to do today was we realized we're hitting that second or third stage of the pandemic where things are starting to reopen. Many of the initial sense of urgency to get financial relief into different organizational and individual hands to address or be able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that a lot of that has quieted down a little bit, and things are starting to return to some degree of what they used to look like a little bit. So today our plan was to talk a little bit about the public health emergency, the upcoming expiration, and then potential extension of that and the implications for that. We will very, very briefly, only because these have gotten a lot of attention, talk a little bit about the financial relief that has come thus far and those legislative efforts. We'll talk specifically about the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act and the loan forgiveness application, because so many member companies on this webinar and members of the AAA and businesses around the country have availed themselves of those programs, and there have been some important changes. We want to make sure you knew about that. Brian will tackle some of the HRSA application and payment summaries for those folks who applied for or registered for the uninsured HRSA reimbursement for COVID-related claims. We'll talk briefly about what we think, and we're calling it CARES 2.0, but we're going to just really talk about where we're going or where we think what's coming next, trying to read the tea leaves, and then we will hit your questions. Of course, to the extent possible, as your questions come through on the question bar, we will try, or one of us will try and answer them, and then we will also share them with the group. If we don't get to the question today, we will email out not only to the individual, but to all of you so that you can make sure that you got the question. Usually if one person's asking it, somebody else is asking it. So just initially wanted to ask Mr. Montes if he would kindly sort of talk. The public health emergency is something that usually doesn't, or when it's declared for a specific region or area. This is sort of an unprecedented time in which it was declared for the entire country. So I was hoping Asbel would just talk a little bit about the significance of a public health emergency and what that affords, and what we might see if it in fact expires at the end of July. Asbel?
Hey, thanks, Scott. So let's kind of talk through, and I'll just briefly talk through the public health emergency, the significance of the public health emergency, and that it typically, and it's actually declared and for the public health space by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is currently Secretary Alex Azar. So the public health emergency, once declared by the President of the United States, opens up funding streams. And allows states to begin to access funds that normally they may not have had the ability to access, as well as, if you've noticed, the numerous CMS waivers that are being issued as well to help out with the pandemic that we're facing, especially in the healthcare space. It allows for the continuity of those waivers through the process too. So a lot of the telehealth that you're seeing in our industry, you've seen the alternative destination transport waiver open up. You've seen some provisions on signature requirements relaxed as well. So that is really the reason why a declaration is usually waived. It's usually a funding thing, and then it just gives a little more opportunity to government officials and to the administration to do some things that may necessarily they wouldn't normally be able to do without some type of congressional approval or statutory approval. Now, the PHE only lasts every 90 days, so it has to be reinstated every 90 days. Now, that's significant. Why? So a lot of the things that we're getting funding for that's coming out of HHS is relative to the declaration of the public health emergency. So expenses that you're incurring, lost revenues that you're incurring. The parameters surrounding that are related to the public health emergency. These waivers that you're operating under are relative to the public health emergency. So currently, this one is they've re-upped it twice. So this is the second time we're in it. And I believe it was April 25th or 26th that it was reinstated by Secretary Azar. And it is set to expire July the 25th or 26th, I believe. It's here on the screen. I should be reading the screen, right? Now, we are hearing some scuttle that may not happen, a renewal of it. But remember, that is scuttle. There's a lot of information that we're getting from downtown DC, as well as from select offices that we're staying in coordination with. I believe, and I'm going to just opine for just a little bit about that. Just keep your ear to the ground. We are starting to see spikes in several different areas regarding censuses increasing in hospitals for COVID-related cases. I'm not so worried about the testing at this point in time, but paying close attention to what your censuses are doing at the hospitals are probably relevant to what you may need to keep in mind that HHS is looking at and the administration is looking at now that they've disbanded the coronavirus task force and it's back under the auspices of the Secretary of HHS, if they're going to extend that again. They may only extend it or declare the public health emergencies and allow the governors to declare it, and then funding may only go to certain hotspots. So it could look a little differently come the 26th, but we are paying very close attention to that as an industry. You're starting to get information from the Congress on different waivers that they believe should be made permanent. A lot of this is surrounding the telehealth space as well, because some of that stuff may need to be codified statutorily. And we do know that there is a package, and when we get to the CARES 2.0, what that might look like in the month of July, when a lot of that seems to be kind of the timeline that there may be another package at that point. So that's kind of a little bit in a nutshell about the public health emergency, what you need to be paying attention to right now, and kind of beginning to expect that this may expire and not be renewed. And what does that mean after that? And then of course, we are, as an association, already putting strategies together to kind of look at the different waivers that we've been operating under, what we want to keep permanent. And then when we get into 2.0, we'll kind of opine a little bit about what we could possibly expect relative to some of those provisions. Scott?
Fabulous, thank you. So Just wanted to provide a quick overview of the relief so far. So just, the Coronavirus Preparedness Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, passed in February 24th, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, a couple weeks after that, as well as the CARES Act, then the PPP program, Healthcare Enhancement Act, and then, of course, the most recent, which is the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act. We're not going to cover every one of these, but we are going to hit on primarily the PPP loan stuff. So we do know that there were some other pending, the HEROES Act, which some of the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, some of the key provisions for that were really, essentially there was an urgent need to address because we were reaching the end of the 8 weeks. That was peeled out into that PPP Flexibility Act. And so the HEROES Act is still technically in play, but just wanted to quickly go through. I know for many of you may or may not realize that you can still, if you haven't already, apply for a PPP loan, this Paycheck Protection Loan, which was initially intended to keep, there was a concern that a whole bunch of people would end up out on unemployment in a very, very short period of time. And so really this initially was intended to provide employers with the ability to continue to pay people for a period of roughly 8 weeks. So individuals were able to really take what would equal roughly 2.5 months worth of payroll and get a loan with, for that amount, and had to, were able to cover not only just some payroll, but then additional costs such as business interest, rent, and some other utilities. Of course, the PPP Flexibility Act, which was just recently passed, did provide some extensions of that. The initial period was, as I said, 8 weeks and time to spend the money. They've extended that out to 24 weeks or until December 31st, whichever is sooner. So it's 24 weeks from funding. They also additionally, in addition to extending that time out, lowered the amount that had to be paid towards payroll costs. So from 75%, which had to be payroll related, now down to 60%, which allows for a little greater flexibility for employers as they're thinking about the utilization of those funds. Additionally, there were some other provisions which permitted employers who previously, if you had applied for forgiveness, you would not be eligible to have the employer payroll tax deferral. That has been changed as well. So as we know, that what were those eligible payroll costs? They were, compensation, both not only cash compensation or, actual payroll compensation, as well as benefit related compensation, group healthcare benefits, retirement plans, state and local taxes. So the EIDL loan program had been shut down. This was that program that provided for that grant of roughly $10,000, and they had been shut down because of basically it sounded like they got overwhelmed, and it was, I read yesterday that it was reopened. So the program has been reopened, I think refunded essentially, and if you are still interested in an economic injury disaster loan, this again is intended for small businesses. The interest rates are low. They provide a potential repayment period of up to 30 years. And so really beneficial opportunities for folks. That has been reopened. So if you were a for-profit small business, the interest rates for those loans are about 3.75. If you're a nonprofit, it's 2.75. So really preferable borrowing terms. So for either of these, of course, if you are going to apply, you are going to need to collect some information, your payroll numbers, as well as you would go to any one of the SBA approved banks. So recognize that a whole bunch of banks, when this program first opened up, essentially sort of crashed the system because a lot of the guidance hadn't come out yet when the program first was approved and made available for folks. So you are going to need to put together some documents so that you can apply for these loans. The individual banks, while there is a standard application, many of them may have their own application, and you would want to just approve to one of the approved one of the approved lenders. You can find out and look for those lenders right here on that website right there for local assistance/find. More recently, though, the Paycheck Protection Program, we had all heard about the loan forgiveness piece, and we're waiting to see what that loan forgiveness application looked like. Well, a couple of weeks ago, the SBA released the Paycheck Protection Loan Forgiveness application. It is an 11-page application and consists really of primarily these 4 components: the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form, which helps you work through what part the calculation piece for forgiveness, Schedule A, then the Schedule A worksheet. The worksheet, that really is probably one of the key documents in the entire application. And we're going to be doing a webinar on this because it is very specific in how you complete this. So the worksheet helps you determine what your head count is, as well as your payroll, to make sure that you did not have a reduction because the forgiveness is based upon whether you maintained headcount and a certain percentage of your payroll. And then there is an optional borrower demographic information form. This is where you would identify that you might be a veteran-owned business, a minority-owned business, and that is, as I said, optional. So in order to apply for forgiveness, you can get the loan application or the forgiveness application through your lender as well, and you would need to submit to the lender the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form, as well as that Schedule A. You're going to need your payroll documentation. That's really getting at showing that you, in fact, did continue to pay folks, and that the FTE documentation. So you'd need to show that your headcount, either through one of 2 mechanisms, which are approved on identifying the number of folks you had, not only during the measurement period, which was the period for which your loan was based on, so prior to this, the COVID emergency, and then the headcount at the end of the covered period, now extended out to 24 weeks. And then any documentation to support those non-payroll costs, so mortgage, interest, rent, utilities, etc. So as I said, we are going to have an entire webinar which will walk you through step by step, section by section of this. As soon as we have nailed down a date, we were originally shooting for, as we approach the 8-week period for most people right now. Now that it's been extended, we recognize that many of you may actually have used those funds and now might be ready to apply for forgiveness with the lender. So we'll be having that webinar very likely in the next couple of weeks, probably 1 to 2 weeks. So the employer tax deferral, this originally, if you had applied for forgiveness under the PPP loan program, you were no longer eligible to avail yourself of the employer tax deferral. And so what this really essentially allows is an employer to defer their part on the payroll tax, and the payment of that. You will have to repay it. Of course, you pay half of it back in 2021. You pay the other half back in 2022. As I said, now that the Flexibility Act was signed, this permits employers to take advantage of both of these. So the employee retention credit, we talked a lot about this on the earlier webinar that we did when we first talked about the economic relief or the financial relief packages that were available, or programs that were available to people. This really essentially, you get a credit on qualified wages, and between that March 13th and December 31st. And if you were, in fact, while that employer was forced to partially or fully suspend operations, and more information can be found about that certainly through the IRS, as well as you go through, you'll find, frankly, if you Google it, you will find more information on this than you could ever imagine. And as well, you can reach out to any of the consultants here at the AAA. So I'm going to hand it off over to Brian Werfel to tackle some of the other financial relief programs and to walk you through the next chunk of available relief. Brian? Brian, he may be muted and doesn't realize.
Nope, sorry about that. Yep, I got caught by the mute button. Good afternoon, everyone. So first, let's talk about the Main Street Lending Program. So the idea here is that this is a set of, it's actually 3 different versions of a loan. that's meant to sort of slide in between the Paycheck Protection Program, which is limited to small businesses, those with under 500 employees, and then what Congress would refer to as the Wall Street companies, those that, by virtue of being publicly traded, have access to capital through the capital market. So hence the Main Street lending program. So these are loans, they're being made through the Federal Reserve that are available to all companies that have up to 15,000 employees and revenues of less than $5 billion. Unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, though, these are true loans. So while they're relatively low interest rates, they are loans and they are not forgivable. So the interest rates here, and it depends somewhat on the specific program, but the minimum loan size is $250,000. Originally it was $500,000, but they did tweak it to lower it a little bit. On the first two facilities, and then there's what's called the extended facility, which is minimum loans of $10 million. But the amount of the loan is based on essentially your revenues. So they give you a multiple on your EBITDA. It tends to be between 4 and 6, depending on the facility. The terms originally were set at a repayment schedule of 4 years. That's now 5 years. But you do get a 1-year deferral on the first payment, which is a nice thing through the end of this year. In terms of the interest rate, it's based on the London Interbank Offering Rate, or LIBOR, plus 3%. So in this environment, that's going to range, and it varies by month, by the way. But right now, you're looking at a little over 4.25% today, and depending on where it goes over the next few years, potentially up to about 5 or 6%, the current forecast. Now, one of the interesting things about this one, and I know Scott and I have had a number of discussions on this, is there are some conditions on this money that are unrelated to the financial aspects itself. Probably the most interesting one is its impact on labor relations. So what you see in that little red box there is essentially your obligation. If you take this money, you must agree to hold a, quote, neutral position on union organizing during the term of the loan. So what that means is if you are not already a union shop and there is a movement within your company to potentially unionize, absent you're taking this money, you would be permitted to not necessarily formally oppose it, but to offer your opinions on whether or not unionization would be a good or a bad thing for the employees. If you take the money, though, you basically have to stay neutral, meaning you can't say you're for it, you can't say you're against it, right? And then again, it goes without saying, but they ask you to represent and covenant that you will not abrogate an existing collective bargaining agreement for the term of the loan plus 2 years. Now, you shouldn't abrogate existing agreements anyway, so I don't know that that's as big an issue, but definitely that unionization and that neutral position is something that's caught a lot of labor lawyers and commentators on the subject sort of off guard. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about going down this road. It would require you to stay neutral on unions. I guess I'll touch on supplemental unemployment benefits. So what the federal government did here is to basically step in and add on to whatever your state's existing unemployment structure was. And what they did was they added a $600 bonus to whatever an individual would qualify under their state unemployment regime. So it's a $600, and help me out, Scott, that's a weekly, right?
Sorry, unmuting. Yes, it is a $600 bonus weekly, and as many know, this has really led to one of the other changes in the Flexibility Act, which I failed to touch on, and I should, is that some of the employers who tried to get employees to come back to work once they had their PPP loan funded ended up having a difficulty getting people to come back because, frankly, they were making more money staying out of work. And so the Flexibility Act, essentially, there were two amendments made to the Flexibility Act. One that said essentially if you could show a good faith effort to hire people for positions that are open, but due to the current financial downturn or the other conditions outside of your control, there was not an available workforce, and you could show documentation for that. That would not count against you on that forgiveness piece. But then also, to the extent that you had an employee who you offered a written offer of reemployment to have them return to their position, but that they declined because because presumably they were getting this additional $600, that then as long as you had that documentation, and one of the other things that they did suggest you do is tell them that they might not be eligible, or that they are not eligible, although I hate to make that blanket statement because they could be for a different reason, but that they are not eligible for unemployment and might have to pay some of that money back. So those also, in both of those circumstances, they would, in that situation, provided you had the documentation, would not count against you as it related to the offset or the reduction in payroll. So, and I'll finish up on this one, Brian, and hand it right back to you, though. So currently, right now, this is set to expire at the end of July. The Republicans are opposed, and this is not a political discussion. The Republicans are opposed to extending. One of the things that they had suggested was possibly a $450 back to work bonus, which would entice or encourage people to return to work. The Republicans believe that this is going to be a quick bounce back, a rebound for the economy, and that it will be very quick and sharp. And so there really isn't a need to extend this. The Democrats, of course, have suggested they would like it to continue. So, this really, I do believe, is impacting some of the ability for people to get workers back to work. And understandably, right, if you're making an additional $600 a week over the course, more than you would make normally, then it does sort of incentivize people to stay out of work. So and I'll hand it back to both Brian and Asbel on this one to sort of talk about what the current status is of what we're calling CARES 2.0, or what the current status is of the next financial relief package. Gentlemen.
Hi, thanks, Scott. So I'll jump in here, and then Brian can has the ability to, after me, if I have left anything unsaid, but most people know I like to talk, and so does Brian. So there are a few different elements of 2.0 that you need to be very cognizant of as the Congress continues to work on 2.0. As we both know, the House passed what their version was through the HEROES Act. That was pretty much dead on arrival, as most knew, in the Senate. And so there was a lot of provisions in the HEROES Act that I would pay attention to. As far as that more than likely won't see the light of day in this CARES, what we're calling CARES 2.0 package. On the phone with leadership late last week, there doesn't seem to be a propensity on the scoring side of it, though you're hearing some opine about it, but remember too, this is an election year. So pay attention to who you see opining on a score and the cost of the bill. And those that they're probably in relatively tight races that might be opining on that, and so pandering as such to the base. But there has been information that has come out of the administration, namely on the CBO that typically scores the bills, about they never get it right. This was information that came directly out of the administration. So there doesn't really seem to be a propensity to really care how much spend is out there. So what does that mean? That means when you have one political party on that can't really agree on the lenses that they're looking through things for this, is typically you will see a package with a lot of stuff in it as they negotiate if price is not an issue or the score is not an issue. So pay attention to that. You're going to start seeing a lot of dialogue towards the end of this month and into right after the 4th is where the negotiations will really kick off. Towards the end, I think it's next week and the week after next, you're going to see the House introduce some healthcare items as well. So pay attention close to that. But we're looking at treatment in place. That is one thing that we feel pretty confident about, that we've got some, that we've really got the Senate engaged on this, from the ranking members to the leadership. Senator Cassidy, our senator, has agreed to kind of lead it as well. Senator Grassley, Senate Finance. But the one thing that we want to make sure everybody understands is currently the way treatment in place is written is it will only last through the public health emergency. And so remember what I opined about at the very beginning of this webinar. The end effective date of that public health emergency is going to be critical here. So that kind of leads into the understanding of what is happening with the emergency triage, treat, and transport piece. You definitely want to stay engaged in that, especially if you were a recipient, because that model does allow for treatment in place and alternative destination, as well as a telehealth component in there. If you did not apply for it and now you're like, boy, I would love to have applied for it, make that known to et3model@cms.hhs.gov. Email them. Tell them that's what you want. Ask them to open up a round 2 application. Ask them to focus on allowing more rural providers to participate without that 24/7 alternative destination requirement that was in there as well. So things like that you can actually do as we continue to work through CARES 2.0. Some of the relief we are working on as well, as most have seen that we have collected data. We wanted to do something around the $48,000 per ambulance spend, which actually gets us to about, I think, $2.86 billion is what we estimate on a strategic relief. And we have heard something that, you know, there seems to not be a propensity to want to do an exact expenditures for a specific industry type, but there is language we're working through that could broaden that, so it doesn't look like it's actually looking, but portion off funds of whatever they do to specifically to EMS as well. Brian, anything to add there?
I don't think so. I think that is an important point about ET3 for those of you that did not elect to participate. You know, I think it is definitely worth sort of, you know, offering up that interest, and if enough people do it, I think it will ease the way for CMS to sort of take a look at reopening it. Their plan all along was likely to do a second round right around this time anyway, you know, for start, you know, this, you know, beginning of next year. So I think the timing is also fairly good right about now. No, that's it. Other than that, that's it. I think you handled it well. So, for those of you that are either nonprofit-based or governmental, you know, there is another funding stream out there, you know, through public health grants and FEMA public assistance grants. So these are grants that were authorized under the CARES Act, and then in addition, there are just general grants out there for normal run-of-the-mill emergencies. We're going to tick off all the important boxes that you need to qualify for these, you know, the declaration of a public health emergency, the declaration under the Stafford Act of, you know, a public health emergency, HHS, CMS, et cetera. All of that has been done, you know, and then we've spoken about the potential extension of that state of emergency. So in terms of the grants themselves, though, there are a number of important components. And for those of you that are nonprofit or governmental, it's likely that you'll meet the vast majority of these requirements. So the applicant must be a state, a territory, a tribe, a local government, or a nonprofit organization. So these do exclude private for-profit enterprises. And then the work must either be permanent, which isn't really what we're looking at here, or emergency, as a result of a declared incident within a designated disaster area, and that legal responsibility or payment for it falls to the federal government. So, and then through the federal government, through the grant money, that you would help mitigate that obligation. So, again, it's a national declaration of emergency. the affected areas, the entire country. So I think you definitely want to take a look at this if you're governmental or you're a nonprofit. In terms of what's out there, there's $100 billion for hospitals and other healthcare providers. Now, this is first come, first serve, so the sooner you get an application in, the better. The idea is that this money would be used to either reimburse for those expenses that are directly attributable to treating COVID patients, or that it would be used to offset the lost revenue. So it's going to operate sort of very similar to the provider relief funds that come directly from HHS, that we'll talk about. There are some restrictions on the use of the money, but those restrictions tend to align with the restrictions that you've already agreed to under the provider relief funding. There's another $27 billion that's out there to improve the response capabilities for COVID. That's squarely within our wheelhouse as EMS agency. Trying to think, I don't think I missed any of the major grant programs, although Scott Asbel helped fill in.
No, I think you hit them all. Although I did see a question up, and this one might be, probably you or best answered by Asbel is, will TIP, if passed, apply to dates prior dates of service or only to claims during any remaining time of the PHE?
So the way that we're trying to write that, it would be the effective date of the declared public health emergency. So assume like March the 1st.
Okay. Okay. So,
but ultimately, if it passes, it's going to depend on how it's written. So
that would be correct. And that is the way that we're advocating for it right now. But once it gets into negotiation, folks, you just have to remember things change in negotiation. But the way that the language has been written has been effective the date of the public health emergency.
And I think it's helpful to mention that most of the relief that's been passed to date has been retroactive, to the start of the declaration of the public health emergency. You'll see that in each of the provider relief funding areas that we're about to touch on. So I'll start there. So under the CARES Act and then the CARES Act, or I'm blanking on the name of it, excuse me, what we're calling Stimulus 3.5, which was, I think, the Payroll Protection Replenishment Act. There is a total of $175 billion that's been allocated to HHS to distribute to healthcare providers total. It was then left to HHS to sort of decide how to allocate that money. And what they've done is basically to divide it into sort of three buckets at this point. The first bucket is a general allocation of $50 billion, which was going to go out to all healthcare providers. Their intent was to ultimately base that off your share of net patient revenues. And if you'd like a long, complicated explanation of what that means, I'll allow Asbel to give it to you. I think the easiest way for all of us to understand it, though, is essentially it's all of your patient revenues from whatever source, less whatever allowances you've already made for bad debt. So any amounts you've collected or any amounts you still reasonably hope to collect in that 2018 year were calculated. And the goal was to give you at least 2% of that amount. But in terms of getting the money out the door, HHS had an immediate problem. They were faced with two conflicting goals. The first goal was to be accurate, but the second goal was to get the money in the hands of healthcare providers quickly. What they elected to do was to break this up into two tranches, an initial tranche of $30 billion that went out between April 10th and April 17th, and they based that on your 2019 Medicare payments. Why Medicare? Well, because HHS already knew what those numbers were, so they could get that money out the door fairly quickly. And then a second tranche of $20 billion where they attempted to get back to that 2% overall number. But there was an application process, and you had to upload certain documentation to validate what your 2018 net patient revenues were. That money started going out the door on April 24th, but the initial few weeks, money was primarily going to hospitals and other Part A entities that do submit cost data to HHS, again, because they had it in-house. And then for us, we were required to submit the application process, and then once they validated our amounts, they started sending that money out in waves. By now, most people have received their money. The deadline to submit applications was June 3rd for the round 2 funding, so hopefully everyone did get it in. And, you know, and hopefully you've seen your money. Now, one other thing that I think should be mentioned for EMS providers is because the initial tranche was based on Medicare dollars, and because the second tranche was intended to basically normalize and get you to what 2% of your overall revenues were, there is a distinct possibility that if Medicare was a disproportionate amount of your revenue, that your round 1 funding would have been larger than the total amount you would have gotten in rounds 1 and 2. Now, if that's the case, you wouldn't see a second payment in the second tranche. And a lot of EMS agencies found that to be the case for them, again, because Medicare is a disproportionate amount of our revenue. It's about 1/3 roughly of all healthcare spending, but for many of you, it's probably closer to 40–50% of your revenues. Now, you're not required to refund the money. It just means you didn't get a round 2 payment. So that's the general allocation.
Brian?
Then what HHS did, their second bucket, is what they're calling targeted allocations. And Scott, could we advance the...
Yeah, well, just in quickly, one of the things that I know I had a question, fielded a question on earlier this week, are for folks who are hearing about possibly some sort of Medicaid monies. And I know I'd fielded that question over to you. Could you just touch upon that real quick?
Sure. So if I can, I'll touch on it as part of just the general second bucket. So in the second bucket, HHS, put out specific dollars to specific targeted allocations. And there were a number of them. So there was a targeted allocation for hospitals that were in particularly hard-hit regions. There was a targeted allocation of, for SNFs. There was a targeted allocation for dentists. There was a targeted allocation for rural providers, hospitals and clinics here. And then there was another one which was designated, and it's around $15 billion. Again, they don't know. It's going to be essentially 2% of the net patient revenue for these providers. But it's those providers that participate in Medicaid or a state CHIP program, but who did not receive money in the general allocation. You know, here you're dealing with a lot of mental health, you know, facilities, sort of community investment or community relations groups. As most of you almost certainly participate in Medicare, and you know, therefore you would have gotten a general distribution tranche, and therefore you're not eligible for that Medicaid tranche. I know that they didn't do a great job of explaining it, HHS.
Just briefly, Brian, another question was, how many folks have you heard that did apply for tranche 2, but hadn't heard anything yet? And, you know, Wayne was the one who posed the question, just their help desk stating that a decision was made on June 1, but that they'll receive an email. But have you been finding or hearing from members that they applied but never heard anything? And when can they sort of, do you think it's fair for them to presume either that they just weren't going to be given anything under that second tranche? Right.
So I think you have to keep in mind that HHS is, you know, this is a new program and that they were asked to roll it out fairly quickly. So I think what's happening is there's just confusion on both sides of this equation. So there were providers that thought they were eligible, that they had submitted a completed application, but there was some problem. So for instance, perhaps they didn't upload the correct tax return. or in the governmental case, there was some confusion over how they even went about checking the appropriate boxes within the portal because they didn't include an option for governmental, et cetera. And then those individuals were sitting around waiting to get their tranche 2 money. An email might have been sent, it might have gone to their spam filter, or they may not have known to look for it because it doesn't come from HHS or a government agency, but rather it comes from UCG, United Healthcare, basically. Basically saying there was a problem, your application is incomplete, and because more than 30 days have elapsed, it timed out. We've heard that from a number of providers. There's a couple others, and Asbel can probably provide a little more color on this, where basically the application was submitted, it was accepted, but there's something in the data that the entity provided that caused HHS to want to take a closer look at it. And in most cases, it's not that the provider overstated their 2018 revenues or net patient revenues, rather that they understated it. And that HHS's concern is that they didn't want to underpay them, right? So it is possible that they're doing, what I call desk audits, if you will, about these, for some providers, and that they may ask for additional money, additional information regarding these financials, and that they may do that by letter, and that the letter may not have gone to the correct address. So anything's possible. If they're saying that you'll get an email and you haven't gotten one, and assuming you've validated that it's not in the spam folder or anything else, I think you got to call them back and just ask, where did the email go? Can they resend it, et cetera? Or frankly, just ask them what the decision was, right? It hasn't gone as smoothly as it could have. Just in the interest of time, let me just go quickly through. There was another option out there that dealt with Medicare advanced payments. So the idea here is that you could borrow or take an advance on up to 3 months of Medicare payments. Keep that money, continue to bill in the ordinary course for a period of another 4 months, and then repay that advance through an offset starting in month 5, which would have been right around July, August, depending on when someone applied for it. And then assuming that the amounts you borrowed represent 3 months worth of payments, you would have paid them through recoupments, by the end of month 7, and then you would have gone and continued to receive payments in the ordinary course. There was a good amount of concern that because revenues are down, that it would take longer to repay these amounts, would accrue, et cetera. So you did see some movement on this in the HEROES Act, where there was a lessening of the terms, so allowing a longer repayment schedule through the recoupment process, lowering the interest rate if the amounts weren't repaid fully during that period of time, and then just basically just lessening the burden, allowing it to be repaid rather than 100% offset, meaning every dollar, allowing only an offset of 25%, so that you'd still get some money in the door during months 5, 6, and 7, but recognizing that it would necessarily mean that the repayment schedule would have to stretch out, for a longer period of time. So while the HEROES Act wasn't, or those provisions of the HEROES Act haven't made their way into subsequent legislation, that is definitely where certainly the House Democrats are leaning in terms of the program. There's fairly broad support, especially among the hospitals, for a loosening of those advanced repayment terms. But they have yet to be passed. The other thing that should be mentioned is you can also see in HHS's perspective that they believe that these are no longer necessary, the advance payments. They put out a document basically saying that as of April 26th, because of the provider relief funding that was part of the CARES Act, they believe the problem solved itself, right? So they're no longer accepting new applications for the Medicare advance payment. So I get this question a lot, which is Brian's talking about something and I have no idea what he's talking about. I apologize, Dave. Let me just simply say that we're referring to the Medicare accelerated and advanced payments here. This was your ability to borrow against future Medicare payments today and then pay it back in the future through a recoupment against future payments. So I hope that answers the question. Scott, should we talk about the uninsured program?
Absolutely.
You want to lead us off?
We're into the home stretch, folks. We know it's a lot to take. So
why don't you lead us off?
Okay, so many of you know, as part of this, one of the concerns, or one of the early on in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Sorry, getting tongue-tied with all of these different pieces of legislation. One of the larger provisions of that, which really didn't get a lot of attention because everyone was focused on the sick time and the paid family medical leave time, was that most of the health plans, or all of the health plans, essentially had to provide that testing or care, sort of that initial in the diagnosis of COVID-19 without any real financial impact to the insured. One of the things, though, that they Congress eventually figured out was that there were a chunk of folks who were uninsured, not covered under any insurance plan. And so there was, in an effort to prevent healthcare providers from being negatively impacted by the care that they provided to the uninsured, essentially HHS put a chunk of the funds, and Brian can probably tell you exactly how much, into a bucket for the purposes of healthcare providers essentially registering to then submit claims under this HRSA portal for the purposes of identifying those who were uninsured but who were treated for or transported as a result of COVID-19 for testing or any COVID-19 related treatment for that diagnosis. Brian, I'm sure you can probably provide a far better explanation than I did.
No, I think Scott hit it. So in terms of the amounts of money that were allocated, we really don't know. We knew that it was going to be a portion of the money that remained of the initial 100 billion after you subtracted the amounts that were otherwise targeted. So it could have been up to about 29 billion. But we don't know ultimately how much they've devoted to this. We can sort of figure out that it's probably in the $10 to $15 billion range, judging by some of the other things they've done since they announced this program. This has probably been the most controversial of the provider relief funding provisions, just because the process that you had to go through to receive this money was difficult, to say the least. So you had to submit an eligibility application on April 27th, and then they were going to allow you to start submitting claims on May 6th. So it was a relatively tight window to get your application in and then start submitting claims to begin with. Then you throw in the fact that, because this money was being allocated on a first come, first served basis, there was some first mover advantage. Everyone went in and tried to get these in quickly, and similar to how there were problems with the portal for round two, there were similar problems with this one. How did governmental entities apply? How did you upload certain information? And then, just to top things off, you had to submit a patient roster of those patients that you believed were eligible. They would give you back an individual, essentially, member ID number for that person, and then you had to submit the claim using that member ID. So it was sort of like a 5-step process to get your payments in, your claims in, excuse me. And then to top it all off, it looks like they initially forgot to include certain ambulance HCPCS codes under their list of payable codes. So as a result, those of you that were successful early on in getting claims in found out that having navigated all of these various hurdles, you just ended up with a denial. There were individuals, that had difficulties with the patient rosters. So It hasn't been a smooth rollout. It's certainly gotten better over time. To my knowledge, there is still money remaining in the program. So, you should, if you haven't already, definitely be trying to get your, claims in. One other thing we should mention on the uninsured program is, as you look at these provider relief funds over time, you can also see that HHS is definitely getting more targeted. The initial programs were for those known to be infected with the COVID virus or for those suspected to be infected. And then it even went so far as to indicate that you could presume in certain instances that a patient was infected with the virus. As we've gone on in time, the later programs are now limited only to those patients that are known to be infected with the virus. And the uninsured program is one of those. So it's for COVID testing or treatment of a known confirmed COVID patient. So one of the other problems EMS runs into is we're not in a position to confirm a diagnosis unless we circle back with whoever did the testing, right? Which creates another barrier for getting these claims in. So I hope that answers, the question that Kathy asked, which is they're including payment for COVID testing for the uninsured. Yes. Well, and then the question is whether or not Medicare or Medicaid will pay for COVID testing completed by EMS agencies. There are a handful of states where their Medicaid programs have indicated that they will pay for testing regardless of who does the testing. I think their assumption, though, is that it would typically be limited to the laboratories. Medicare, it is highly unlikely that they will pay for testing done by the EMS agency. Keep in mind, in their mind, testing is not the swab. Testing is the actual culture and the conclusion, so which would still require the lab even when the swab is done in a non-clinical setting. So unfortunately, nothing on the landscape there in terms of the testing. All right, so moving on to the funds themselves. If you took round one or round two general allocation funds, or if you took funding for the uninsured program, there were certain terms and conditions you had to agree to. First, you needed to essentially represent and warrant that you would only use the money to either compensate you for direct COVID-related expenses, or that you would use it to offset lost revenue that you've suffered as a result of the public health emergency. Now, that is a relatively easy hurdle or representation for you to make. All of you have been impacted in one way, shape, or form, right? In addition, there were certain other affirmative covenants that you needed to make, meaning things that you would agree not to do. Probably the biggest one for some of you is that you would not use it to pay executives to the extent their salaries were over a certain amount. It's roughly $197,000. It's up on the slide now, $197,000, right? There are some other things you can't do, and so for instance, you can't advocate for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. You cannot use it for lobbying costs, specifically if you're going to lobby for gun control measures. You can't use it for routine business expenses that were incurred regardless of the COVID pandemic. My personal favorite, you can't use it to promote the legalization of drugs, or you cannot use it, and Scott, help me out. Was it for the importation of chimpanzees or the use of chimpanzees for medical testing?
No, I believe it was the importation of chimpanzees.
Okay, and it was chimpanzees specific or all primates?
Nope, just chimpanzees.
Got it. Okay, so don't do that. And then we got to get to, if we fast forward a slide here, we'll get to the one that probably caused most consternation among our industry. And that's, it essentially imposed a restriction on balance billing on you. And this is not only caused a great deal of concern in the industry, but probably the most confusion. So what they're technically saying is that you must agree that you won't attempt to collect from the patient or from the uninsured patient an amount that is greater than what the patient otherwise would have been required to pay had the care been provided by an in-network provider, meaning you. So it does not prohibit you from collecting a copayment or a deductible that is assessed by the patient's insurance. So Medicare, if the patient has a copayment, you can still collect that. If the patient has an unmet deductible, you can still collect that. Similarly, on the commercial side, Medicaid typically doesn't have copayments or deductibles. On the commercial side, it doesn't prohibit you from collecting the copayments or deductibles assessed by the patient's plan, right? However, in most cases, many of the major insurers have agreed that to the extent the care is related to COVID testing or COVID treatment, they're going to waive the coinsurance and deductibles anyway. And in the uninsured case, there are no coinsurance or deductibles because there is no plan, right? Under the uninsured program, it just simply requires you to accept their payment, which is the Medicare payment, as payment in full. What's caused a lot of confusion here is, I think, a misunderstanding on our part as to who makes the determination as to whether something's COVID-related or not. We are certainly entitled to our opinion as to whether or not something is COVID-related or not, but ultimately the decision is being made by the plan. So for commercial payers, the way it will basically work is you will submit the claim to them, and they will either pay it or deny it. If they pay it, they will then likely waive the coinsurance and deductible and instruct you not to balance bill the patient, assuming you were otherwise able to do so, right? If they don't waive the copayment, it's their essentially stating that the claim is not COVID-related, and therefore you can continue to balance bill. So the advice that I think is probably the most helpful to you here is basically just follow the remittance advice. If it indicates you can balance bill the patient, you can continue to balance bill the patient. If it indicates that you cannot balance bill the patient, it is likely because they are saying that it is COVID-related, and with that likely will come their payment of the coinsurance and deductibles. So there is sort of an upside to their determining that they're COVID-related. Scott, I'll turn it back to you to talk about accountability.
Yeah, and I know we're running a few minutes long, so I'll be quick. Just, again, I think we sort of probably hit this a few times, that just recall that if you received any funds under any of the relief packages, that you want to be able to account for those funds. That includes with the PPP loan, because you are going to need to show what part went to payroll versus those approved non-payroll expenses. So just be sure that you're tracking those costs and using, and the use of the money separately, and make sure that you're talking with your accountant or any legal folks that you need to make sure. I know a lot of people are telling me that they've just set up a separate account in their accounting software so that they can, isolate, segregate those funds and make sure that they're using them for one of the approved reasons. Recognizing, right, looking at that, understanding the benefits of the risk as we go back to the Main Street lending program and that obligation to remain neutral as it relates to unions. Just one thing you should know is that, and usually this is sort of the evolution of these type of events, that there was a piece of legislation that was filed 3 days ago, the COVID-19 Whistleblower Protection Act, which essentially provided, as we would expect, right, that was introduced by Senator Warren and Markey and several others, but it was this idea that essentially a prevailing whistleblower would be entitled to make whole relief, including reinstatement, double back pay with interest, uncapped compensatory damages, as well as attorney fees. So this is for an individual who, filed a complaint with a regulatory agency and essentially telling them that, hey, my employer or my company has been misusing those funds. So just be aware that this is, and most of these pieces of legislation included a ton of money in relation to OIG oversight. So ensuring that you recognize that this will be the next round. We've already seen a couple of stories, as the ones I pulled up here were just a few of this occurring. And so important that that you're, I know our folks who are on these kind of things generally are doing the right thing. That's why you're doing education. The people who tend to not do the right things don't care about making sure they know how to do the right things. So just questions, we've gotten a bunch that I think we answered. I don't see any outstanding right now. The AAA, of course, has a COVID-19 page where you can find all of the resources as well as any of the webinars that had been previously presented, and you can be watched at a later date. So be sure to join us for on June 30th as it relates to the idea of financial sustainability for AAA's Wayne Jarecki, Jamie Pafford Gresham, and Sean Tyler will be talking about, financial stability tips for EMS providers, as well as these are some other webinars. We have the clinical update, which with Randy Strozik and Dr. Rock tomorrow, and myself, as well as several other programs. And while they're not in here, some of these programs going out as far as July 9th and August 13th, there will be several others that we have in the pipeline right now. But for any of those programs, of course, you can go to the AAA at ambulance.org. So I want to thank you all. I'm going to hand it back to Meg to close us out, but thank you all for attending and appreciate your time and attention. Meg?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Scott, Asbel, and Brian. I won't keep you guys any longer, but just remember that we'll be sending out an email in just a little bit with the recording of today's presentation and the PowerPoint slides. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to today, or you think of anything else, feel free to reply to my email or shoot us an email over at info@ambulance.org. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today and hope everyone has a great weekend.